Hi, I'm Kristopher Teters. I'm the author of Practical Liberators, and you are watching Author's Voice.
Welcome to Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. This program is called A House Divided. I am your host for the day. My name is Bjorn Skaptason. A House Divided is the show on Author's Voice where we discuss books about Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, the U.S. presidency, things like that. We do that because we are live streaming to you from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. And since we are in a Lincoln and Civil War bookshop, then Lincoln and Civil War gets a certain privilege of place in our choice of topics. This is a show that gives us an opportunity to introduce you to some of the best new writing in Civil War literature, and also bring in some of the big names in Civil War literature as well. So let's jump right on in. The book we have today is Practical Liberators by Kristopher A. Teters. Practical Liberators, and that is from University of North Carolina Press, $32.95. Our subtitle is Union Officers in the Western Theater During the Civil War. Kristopher Teters has joined us. Thank you very much for coming in, Chris.
Thank you very much for having me.
Chris comes to us, he comes to us from a lot of places, but I think essentially he comes to us from Alabama, from the University of Alabama. We could get it out of the way right up front if we have to.
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide out there.
Let's just get it out there so people aren't waiting for it.
Absolutely.
No, Chris comes to us from University of Alabama. He studied with a couple of other veterans of Author's Voice, just to show you're in good company. Chris has studied with George Rabel down there, and he studied with Glenn Brasher, both of who have featured their books here on Author's Voice. Chris teaches U.S. history at Western Governors University and is currently in Ohio. Am I right about that?
I'm living in Alabama, but I go back and forth a lot.
Back and forth between Alabama and Ohio.
From Ohio originally.
Okay, folks, if you're watching this on Facebook Live, if you're watching the Facebook Live feed, you can ask the questions. I've got a whole pile of questions here. It doesn't matter if I even ask a single one of them. This is your chance to ask questions. So if you do so, use the Facebook comments section if you're watching the Facebook Live feed, and you'll have a chance to ask your questions. I have it right here. I have my tablet here on the on my table, and so I'm going to get your questions. If you're watching on the authorsvoice.net website, you have a chance to ask your questions in a space below there. So either way you want to do it, ask your questions. I will ask Chris. Chris will answer them for you. All right, let's jump right on into this. No, there's one more very crucially important thing that I forgot about. Buy the book. Buy the book. That's why UNC Press can send Chris here. That's why we can have this program for you. This is your chance to buy a first edition signed copy of a terrific new Civil War study. So with that out of the way, let's jump right into the question and answer. Welcome to Author's Voice, Chris.
Thank you very much.
Now, Chris, right up front in your book, you evoke the ghost of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. Now, I don't know how old you are, but I can guess. I know how old I am. I know how old most of my colleagues are that are into the Civil War. And there is no book other than The Killer Angels that has hooked more people into the study of the Civil War. And this 1973 masterpiece, you're looking at a first edition, of The Killer Angels right now. The little book that could, won the Pulitzer Prize, came out of nowhere to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1973. And the author, Michael Shara, especially draws one character, Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of the 20th Maine, into this incredibly dramatic, motivating, inspiring character. And then later he became Jeff Daniels, played him in the movie Gettysburg. And you mentioned right up front in your book that Gettysburg, Chamberlain, had part of that hook for you. Tell us about that. Tell us about how that got you into history.
Yeah, it was definitely important in why I got interested in the Civil War long before I began this project. I was still in grade school when the movie Gettysburg came out, and my dad wanted to go see it one afternoon when it was still at the theater, and I went through the movie, and I was fascinated particularly with the character of Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, and I was really hooked at that point. I started watching more and more documentaries. I started reading about Colonel Chamberlain. I started reading his own works, his own memoirs. I eventually later read, of course, The Killer Angels. And I was very, at least from the movie Gettysburg when I was really young, I was moved by how idealistic Chamberlain was about the war, about how moral he saw, particularly the emancipation or the emancipationist cause. And I think the way it plays into this work is when later on when I went to graduate school, still interested in the Civil War, and I decided on this topic, I think I knew that by this point I had read a lot of the Civil War literature. I'd read James McPherson and others that study Civil War soldiers, so I knew that there was going to be a great deal of opposition to emancipation. I knew I wasn't going to find Chamberlains throughout the Western theater, or at least a majority. But I think I was hoping to find more Chamberlains. I was hoping that more of them would kind of fire my imagination like they once did when I think I was in the 7th grade when I saw that movie, Gettysburg. And I was hoping, maybe there'll be more of those types of people. And what I found was it was just the opposite. I found less and less of these moral soldiers, so to speak, when it came to the emancipation question. They were much more pragmatic. They were much more practical, and so that's kind of how the Chamberlain story leads into this book, I think.
Right. Looking for that idealistic fictional character that we loved when we were young, and finding out that that actual history is so much more complicated.
Yes.
So you decided to take on officers in the Western theater in order to get a sample of attitudes towards emancipation. Why did you choose officers?
I chose officers because I wanted to look at policy as well. I didn't just want to look at attitudes. There were several books already that had looked at attitudes and how they felt about emancipation and how they felt about race or African American troops. I wanted to look at that, but I wanted to find a new angle. And in order to look at how policy unfolded on the ground, I decided very early on, of course, when I was starting this project, that I had to look at the high command. I had to look at how, and not just Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman, that they of course feature prominently in the work, but also lieutenants, captains, lower level officers that sometimes made very difficult decisions on the ground. So I chose officers because I knew they would be involved in the formulation of policy. I knew they would be involved in how it evolved, how it changed, how it started, more so than enlisted men. And so that's what kind of got me looking at Western officers. And I knew there was a very, very rich literature out there, primary sources. I had always been fascinated by soldiers' letters, and I knew that officers' letters would be readily available, and there would be probably more than I could ever read. And I wish I would have had time to read more. As many as I read. I wish there was
like this. You almost wish it were even bigger. And this is one of those books that utilizes an enormous database of primary source literature. You've just got So many letters of lieutenants and captains and majors. You've got diaries, and you've got the kind of letters back and forth from home, letters that go to different types of audiences. They'll say different things if they're writing to mom versus the wife, or Sherman writing a policy letter to Grant, because he loved to write those long letters from Vicksburg. Well, when you decided to look at Westerners, what were the Western attitudes towards slavery and African American people that struck you as being different from things you'd seen before, Eastern attitudes, if you will?
Yeah, I don't think, I think when most, and again, when we talk about huge numbers of people, we always have to qualify it. I mean, coming up with a representative sample is a whole nother question, but for the officers and all the letters I looked at, I think most of them saw emancipation as a military necessity, as something that had to be done in order to win the war. They say it, when I started kind of gathering all these letters and looking through my many Word documents where I had typed out parts of it, I saw the same thing over and over, that they were saying, they said, of course, in different language, but they were saying that it was necessary to win the war. It was necessary to take labor away from the Confederacy. It was necessary to use that labor for the Union. If it would help win the war, then I'm for it. One of them, I think, said teeth and toenails. I'm for that. They use very vivid language. It makes the letters very compelling to read because of this, because they're so personal. Because they're writing to their moms or their sisters or their wives, and so they're using this great language. But I think they saw union as first and foremost, and I think emancipation became a way to save the Union, a way to win the war for many of them, and I think many of them, it depends what periods of the war you're talking about. But when emancipation first occurs in early 1863, many officers express intense opposition toward the proclamation. In fact, I think at every stage when the war kind of turned more emancipationist, whether that would be the first Confiscation Act or the second Confiscation Act, or the actual emancipation, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, the final Emancipation Proclamation. I think at every stage you see that opposition. They don't like a critical mass of them don't like the way the war is going. They don't like the new direction. They didn't sign up for that. Some of them do, and some of them don't. It's a very divided army.
Yet all these things keep happening, and the war continues. One thing I like about the book, I think I think this book is framed well, in my opinion. I think this work, as you could imagine, it traces the evolution of opinion chronologically, but also you take some time to define what attitudes are and where the attitudes of soldiers lie on what you might call a political spectrum. You go from very conservative to supporting emancipation. So how did you define the notion? I only want to work on one of those. How did you define the notion of very conservative? Did people with the very conservative opinions, did they hang in there, or did the Army actually lose these guys?
I think, well, one way I defined it, there's a couple different ways I use that term, very conservative. One way, in the opening chapter, I use the term very conservative when I'm talking about policies, when I'm talking about how what they decided to do when African Americans would flee to Union lines. How would they treat them? Would they open up their lines to certain runaway slaves or prohibit them? And when I use the term very conservative, it refers to, in that opening chapter, to prohibiting all slaves from coming in Union lines. And that was that was set up very early on in the war, November of 1861, by Henry W. Halleck. Henry W. Halleck, in a famous order, General Orders Number 3, is going to say bar slaves from coming into Union lines. And so, from a policy standpoint, that's how I use the term very conservative. Mm-hmm. Now, I do think there were some, there's as far as attitudes, someone like William Tecumseh Sherman is going to stay pretty conservative with attitudes. He is going to be he's as far as emancipation goes, it's going to be very difficult to get him on board. And I think there are several officers like that. I think, but I do see, as far as attitudes go, I do see by the second half of 1863, I do see even the most conservative officers, whether it's Democrats or for whatever reason, why they opposed emancipation, was political or it's racial or there's all these reasons that they gave. There is a shift, and even your most conservative officers are starting to say, people in the book like Alfred Pirtle or Henry Van Antwerp are starting to move towards saying, okay, I never really was for emancipation, but now it seems like we have to do this. Mm-hmm. It's a necessity. I think Alfred Pirtle, I remember him saying something like, I don't even recognize myself anymore. That's how much he had changed in his attitudes.
And just within a year or so in the service. Well, we could go through a lot of stuff here. I mean, the government's first great challenge in dealing with African Americans fleeing slavery and coming to the Army is that challenge that you referred to, Henry Halleck,
yes.
In Missouri. But Missouri provides us with a unique example, doesn't it? Because slavery was legal in Missouri. Once the Emancipation Proclamation came, it certainly did not cover Missouri. Right. But still, Halleck and then his successors had all sorts of problems, didn't they, with how to deal with emancipation in Missouri, where it's not supposed to happen.
Mm-hmm. I would say, and I would add to that a bit to talk about Kentucky as well. Kentucky becomes very problematic, both the border states, because the emancipation doesn't apply there, and because they're so concerned with slaveholding unionists. And I mean, this is of course Lincoln's fear. He does not want to alienate these crucial supporters, and you have John C. Fremont, who immediately takes action very quickly in the war.
Right.
Has to pull it back. I mean, Lincoln's kind of defining the limitation, how far you can go in that case. And then Halleck comes in and says, okay, well now, of course, Halleck's personal attitudes kind of supported this too, but Halleck's going to come and say, okay, now prohibit all slaves from coming into Union lines. And in that general order, he talks about the idea that African Americans were giving information to the Confederates or something. That General Order Number 3, of course, I never found any proof of or where he got that notion from. I think he's very much he doesn't want to deal with slavery, and that includes returning slaves. What Halleck, because of course there's later a prohibition against using the army to return slaves, what Halleck wants to do is keep slaves in Missouri out completely and never have to deal with the question. Now, the problem he's going to face, even from the outset, even in Missouri, and then when his campaigns go into western Tennessee, northern Mississippi, is lower-level officers aren't always going to obey. They're going to sometimes allow those slaves into Union camps, and then there's going to be this conflict on the ground that I talk about in the first chapter, where they're supposed to not, but they are, but then they get in, Grant at a few points gets in this awkward position where he's asked to return, slaves, and it's they weren't supposed to be there in the first place. But the fact that they got there created this very difficult dilemma.
Right. They created the problem for him, and then he had to deal with the problem. Well, that brings up the idea that To what extent did the opinions of the junior officers reflect those of the commanders? And to what extent did they rebel against these policies?
I think that's a very complicated question, one that's hard to answer definitively. But I will say I think there's enough junior officers that are pushing against their commanders' policies in the first roughly 14, 15 months of the war before the Second Confiscation Act, before their commanders would start moving in a more emancipationist direction. There's enough junior officers pushing in an emancipationist direction to say there were definitely a lot that disagreed, and they do so for different reasons. They don't always cite the same reasons for disagreeing. I mean, for example, James Garfield, who's of course going to become more prominent later, is deeply conscientious, and he's one of the more moral soldiers, one of the maybe idealistic ones I was looking for to start with in Joshua Chamberlain. But there's going to be other officers that are going to think, well, this is against the law to turn out slaves, because if the regiment turns slaves out of Union lines, they'll be recaptured. It'll be the same thing as returning them to their owners. And so some of them were holding up legal arguments to not do that. And then, of course, you have the First Confiscation Act, which does allow for the seizure of slaves who were actively employed in the rebellion. And this
was very early in the war.
That's very early. Yes. Benjamin Butler and Fort Monroe in 1861. And the First Confiscation Act, Halleck is even going to kind of allow for some groups of slaves to come in Union lines because of that act. He's going to get in a little bit of trouble for that blanket prohibition, and so he's going to eventually allow some slaves that fall into those categories under the First Confiscation Act, and even a little beyond the First Confiscation Act, to slaves that help the Union Army in different ways to stay in Union lines.
But one of the fascinating things about the book is you get to see how much these policies are reflected on the ground and the problems that it causes for officers on the ground. So it's going to be a lieutenant or a captain that has a runaway freedman in the camp, and some of his men have hidden this person in a corn crib or the attic, or they're running him around, and so these are the men that have to answer questions that I suppose Halleck thinks are simple as the First Confiscation Act portrays them as simple as, is this person's master loyal or a rebel? Well, how's that work on the ground? Is there a trial? Is there?
They don't. I mean, that's one of the problems, and that's even a problem with the Second Confiscation Act. This is a problem beyond the First Confiscation Act, because with the second, it even becomes more problematic in some ways with the Second Confiscation Act in the summer, because the Union forces in the West are going to allow huge numbers of slaves into Union lines in Louisiana and West Tennessee, but the Second Confiscation Act was only applied. It expanded who was, of course, then there's questions of whether even the Second Confiscation Act, historians disagree on this, actually freed the slaves, or just permitted the army to confiscate them, take them in, and it actually had to be a court that would find that the owner was treason. This is Sherman's legalistic interpretation.
Right.
And you can certainly see that in the statute, that it very much could be a court that would have to free the slaves, so to speak. But then there were other commanders. You have someone like Samuel Curtis, who's granting free papers based on the Second Confiscation Act and in the Department of Missouri. And so he's actually, so there's different commanders doing different things, but determining whether a master, whether it's under the First Confiscation Act, determining whether a slave had actively been employed in the rebellion, or the Second Confiscation Act, determining whether a master of a particular slave was a rebel in sympathies, was a difficult question. And they never really, it's hard to pull that apart, because sometimes you're relying on the testimony of the slaves to figure out, what did their master do? Was their master a rebel?
In which case, now you're taking testimony from slaves, which apparently we weren't supposed to do. But this war is shaking everything up, isn't it? But I'm glad you brought him up, because Samuel Ryan Curtis is one of my favorite Union officers in the West, and part of it is because he has he makes a pretty long intellectual journey pretty quickly.
He does.
And so tell us a little bit about Sam Curtis and bring us up to these free papers, because his idea for free papers there at Helena is really one of the key parts of the early part of this book.
Yeah, and Curtis had distinguished himself early on. He's very much in it to save the Union at first, but he had distinguished himself very early on in the war at a battle known as Pea Ridge, and he very quickly became more prominent. And he does not, unlike Sherman and Grant for the most part, he does not even need the Second Confiscation Act. He starts to liberate slaves on his march through Arkansas that are blocking his supplies, and so he starts liberating them, and then they throw away all their axes and things that they were using to block his roads, and so it's very clear to see, well, this is military necessity. Now, and this is showing the complexity of these attitudes in the early part of the war. Not all the men under his command, under that column that was marching, do agree with that policy. Some of them are worried that they'll alienate the people of Arkansas, or so you have this complexity in these attitudes that are existing. When Curtis arrives in Helena, Arkansas, he does implement a very pro-emancipation policy. He grants free papers. He even helps African Americans sell cotton. He's going to employ, I think they build a fort. The chief engineer of the fort said it wasn't really of any military value, but it employed the runaway slaves doing some kind of labor for the army. Mm-hmm. The problem there is Frederick Steele is going to assume command when Curtis is elevated to departmental command, and Frederick Steele is going to be much more conservative. And this is back to your question, how these attitudes matter so much.
Yeah.
And Steele is going to reverse a lot of that, mm-hmm. including returning slaves to their owners. He's going to get in trouble for that.
Right.
So
a slave that has a free paper from Curtis might find that it's not worth anything.
That's right.
Under Steele.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And he's definitely not going to issue any more of them. Mm-hmm. It's his commission that gets held up. Grant has to testify, or at least give affirmation of Steele's character and his ability, because he's under so much heat for this one incident that gets reported where he lets somebody recover their, and I think he's using the federal forces to recover their slaves in his lines. So there's a lot of dispute on why and did he do it and all that. And Grant has to come forward and talk about his character.
Well, you see that a lot it came up a number of times here, and you see it a lot in the literature at large. No Northerner wants to be a slave catcher. Mm-mm. Even Northerners that are pro-slavery. Mm-hmm. There's some, and I think that goes back to we'll get back to your book here in a minute. But it goes back to that indignity of the fugitive slave law and the states' rights of northern states impinged upon. And so no self-respecting Northerner wants to be a slave catcher. Right. And so suddenly you start to see some of that happen here with your officers. Okay, I'm very conservative. I'm even pro-slavery, but now they're making me be a slave catcher in my Union uniform, and I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
Well, the clock is rushing forward, and we haven't even gotten to Vicksburg yet. But so I'm gonna leap forward for a little bit.
Sure.
And but we do need to touch on one major landmark, and that's we went from First Confiscation Act to Second Confiscation Act. Then we get to the Emancipation Proclamation, and that really stirs the pot amongst these officers. And I mean, did a lot of these officers threatened to resign by the time it came to emancipation? Did you find any of yours actually taking that step, actually getting out of the Army?
In Grant's papers, there's when an officer would resign, he would or offer his resignation. Grant would have him dishonorably discharged in all the cases. In all the cases I found.
So actually following through on the threat is
There was one officer who resigned. I believe his last name was McDowell. Right around the proclamation, he was very much against it. I couldn't. The letter stopped, so you can't see, where he says I'm going to resign directly. There were a lot of threats of resignation too that didn't happen. A lot of it was they were angry at the moment. They were, and they didn't go quite that far. Kentucky officers were particularly angry about this, and the Army's going to have all kinds of trouble. I know we probably don't have time to get into all the specifics in Kentucky, but the Kentucky on the ground was just as much of a mess as Missouri, trying to figure out who's eligible to be confiscated. You have officers who are trying to keep slaves out of Union lines, and Kentucky officers are going to be both opposed to emancipation and African American troops. The opposition was definitely intense, and some of the support was intense. And one of the examples I use in the book is Oscar Jackson, who was shot in the face at the Battle of Corinth, and who was nursed back to health by an African American servant. And Oscar Jackson didn't start off as an abolitionist by any stretch, or even pro-emancipation. But then when he's about to return to the Army after he's recovering from his wounds in Hocking County, Ohio, where it's not very good territory for being an abolitionist or even pro-emancipation, he gives a speech saying he's an abolitionist, and he had a revolver, a gun, on the stand as he was giving that speech. So some of them are in a. So I want to emphasize that there are a lot of officers expressing intense opposition, but then there are a lot of officers who are expressing a lot of support, and it's this practical reason that seems to be moving most of them in that direction, that they think this will help them win the war. But then there's some, like I said, who are just like the kind of counterpoint to Oscar Jackson, who are just as much opposed to emancipation.
Right. Well, we have a number of people who the first great challenge to their point of view comes when they meet freed people, when they meet African American people for the first time. Oscar Jackson certainly had a huge awakening in that. But did you see a change in the feeling of the Army, or even a change in the feeling of the policy once the Army came in contact with African Americans?
There's some.
Yeah.
There's some. And give you an example, and this is an earlier example that your question immediately made me think of. Captain William Moore, who was killed during the war, but he was from Wisconsin, and William Moore is going to be outraged that when he sees that slave owners are using women in the fields and working in the fields, and that issue, the kind of gender norms of the time are going to it's going to throw him into a rage in which he's going to write all this stuff in his diary. So when he saw those slaves in northern Alabama, he definitely did change. He definitely saw this. There was an officer who was Marcus Spiegel, who was opposed to slavery at first, who eventually is going to see the barbarities of the institution in Louisiana and is going to shift as well towards a more pro-emancipationist position. But then there are others who see kind of, let's say, the pitiful conditions in the contraband camps, and they're moved in almost just the opposite direction. They're saying, now wait, let's not be sympathetic to African Americans. For them, it was, see, this is evidence why we shouldn't be emancipating. We can't support this population. We can't feed them. We can't properly clothe them, and they're in worse condition than they were in slavery. So it kind of can cut both ways.
Yeah. Well, we are here, as I said, before at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, and one of the things that we're so proud of is that we can show you original artifacts of the time. So if there's somebody that shows up in Chris's book, we can show you his signature right there. Now this is Major General James B. Mcpherson, and this is a carte de visite, and an original carte de visite from life. It has its back mark, A.S. Morse, photographer, Department of the Cumberland. So this would have been taken probably in 1864, right before he went out onto the Atlanta campaign. And James Mcpherson is not, he's not one of the major setters of policy, but he is doing a lot of work there at Vicksburg, is he not? Especially after the Gibraltar of the Confederacy surrenders, now the Union Army has all of these freed people coming into Vicksburg to deal with, and Mcpherson had to make a lot of decisions about that.
Once Vicksburg surrenders, and well, even during the campaign, if you want to really, wherever Grant's army goes during the Vicksburg campaign, it's going to break up the institution of slavery. That's one of the themes that I tried to bring out in my work, and nowhere else is this more vividly illustrated. In some ways, in Vicksburg, is wherever the army goes, the institution of slavery is going to start getting broken down. There are going to be thousands of African Americans who flee to Union lines. And one thing that Grant and McPherson and his other corps commander, McClernand, his other corps commanders are going to have to figure out what to do is they're going to have to figure out how do we handle this huge influx of runaway slaves. Free, actually, many of them, because it would have, Mississippi was under the Emancipation Proclamation. And so what do we do? And Grant, they decide really quickly to try to free the slaves that are the most valuable to the army. They want to try to employ them as laborers, employ them as teamsters. McPherson is involved with employing slaves to work on the fortifications at Vicksburg. Make sure they're doing something to help the army. Sherman, Grant, McPherson all understood that slavery was dying across that region, and they wanted to make sure that it was, so they not only supported the policy because they believed that it would help the Union, that's exactly how they carried it out. They supported it for pragmatic reasons, and then they implemented it in a very pragmatic way. Mm-hmm. And so that's one point that I try to emphasize in the book, and Vicksburg definitely shows that.
Vicksburg's a terrific example of that. But we eventually, the person most associated with Western soldiers, we're only just getting to him now in the second half of the show. If a Civil War Union soldier served in the West, he considered himself one of Uncle Billy's boys, one of Sherman's men. And therefore, I think it's a great contribution to the book that you dedicate an entire chapter to Sherman's march. Mm-hmm. Well, you basically mean from Chattanooga to Atlanta and thence to the sea, is because you're looking at the attitudes and the decisions made during Sherman's march. Sherman did not want to be seen as any kind of emancipator, but he did follow through with it. And so you've sort of answered the question with respect to McPherson, but why? Why did he so effectively follow through with emancipating these people?
Well, I think Sherman also realized Sherman's complicated, and luckily for historians, Sherman writes nonstop about his opinions on things, and so we get a view of him in some ways more so than Grant, even though we have a lot on Grant too. But Sherman really gives us an inside view of his mind and the workings of his mind. Sherman, even when he was in Memphis in 1862, Sherman's going to talk about the fact that he's going to agree with confiscation. He's not necessarily going to agree. He's going to make a distinction between confiscation and emancipation. But he's going to agree with confiscation because it's going to weaken the enemy to confiscate the slaves of rebels. he's not going to ever really, I think his racial attitudes, and also he also talks a lot about how an army, in other words, he's marching this army from Atlanta to Savannah in his march to the sea, and how, from a practical point of view, how are they going to care for thousands and thousands of slaves following his army? But he can't entirely stop that. He tries. He goes on plantations himself during that march and instructs African Americans to stay where they're at. He has his staff officers. There's some brilliant passages in Henry Hitchcock. He has several staff officers do the same thing and say, but he also, at the same time he's doing that, he's also ordering that able-bodied men that could serve in his pioneer corps, not soldiers, because Sherman would never be for African American soldiers. He's continuously complaining about being forced into that direction. But African Americans who could do other jobs in his army, he would take in, and he would be happy to. But what he quickly finds, and what many of his corps commanders, even the corps commanders who, someone like Jefferson Columbus Davis, who doesn't want have anything to do with being a liberator, African Americans are going to follow Sherman's army. It's like a magnet, and they're going to follow whether he wants them to, whether some of these officers do or not. And there's going to be other officers who are more sympathetic. Sherman's army is going to consist of other officers. Absalom Baird is going to be a lot more sympathetic, for example, and they're going to try to stay, African Americans are going to understand this, and they're going to stay close to his camp. Jefferson Davis is not going to be as sympathetic, as everybody knows the tragedy at Ebenezer Creek.
Yes.
But so Sherman, almost in spite of himself, becomes a liberator. He's never happy about it. The second year he uses all kinds of derogatory language about the African Americans following his columns, and he wants to rid his army of the African Americans as soon as they can. But he can't entirely prevent it, and especially by this point in the war, something like Halleck did back in 1861, where he has a strict prohibition against slaves. I mean, that's not even politically possible anymore. And so the army had assumed an emancipationist purpose. Georgia was under the Emancipation Proclamation, and so it's going to happen. And Sherman becomes this liberator, like I said, in spite of himself, and reluctantly.
Well, but by 1864, were Uncle Billy's boys more enthusiastic about liberation than they had been? They certainly seemed to be enthusiastic about liberating a lot of property from the plantations that they came across, whether it be from the cookhouse or something, the money buried in the out back. But did they become more enthusiastic in liberating people
I think they generally were.
when they actually encountered the opportunity to do so?
I think they generally were. By that point in the war, the army had changed quite a bit, and I think they generally were. And some a lot more than their commander were enthusiastic about liberating the slaves. And again, this kind of, you can see them, taking them in and using them as personal servants, for example. One thing you do not see in Sherman's rank, if you see a more pro-emancipationist sentiment, you do not necessarily see a revolution in racial attitudes. They're not changing. That's one of the points I want to make here is, even if you have this turn towards emancipation, or even African-American troops in some cases, that was a little bit harder than emancipation. There was less support, I would say, overall. That was a tougher issue for many Union officers in the West. But with race, they didn't change that much. I didn't find them change. They're going to be talking about, I can't remember the officer's name offhand, but one officer said, basically, to paraphrase, no act of President Lincoln is going to change African Americans in his mind. This idea of equality, the idea of voting rights, of citizenship. That is not something I found in my research at all. There's not going to be a great revolution. The men who march to the sea and beyond are not going to become a bunch of racial egalitarians.
Right, right. Well, which I guess this calls for some speculation, but you have at least one short passage about it. Did it matter to the freed people what the opinions of their liberators were, as long as they were free?
I suspect it could matter a little bit, and I say this. There's a couple things I want to say. I think it's complicated because there's a significant amount of abuse in the Western Union Army. So for African Americans who were abused by Western officers, it mattered a great deal what their opinions were, and that the fact that they were still racist and they still regard them so negatively. I think the most important thing for many of the African Americans that followed Sherman's army, because they greet Sherman himself even as a liberator, they react very positively to Sherman. There's a discussion in Savannah. I think Edwin Stanton has a discussion with some African Americans about Sherman because Sherman had gotten such bad press about how he had treated African Americans during the campaign, and they're all very positive about it. So I think the most important part for them, of course, their voices are a lot harder to get at in this study. You could look in the WPA narratives and things like that, but those are problematic for understanding what African Americans were thinking in 1864, right. For a variety of reasons historically. I think the most important part was freedom, but I do think it did matter to them some what white officers were thinking, and they did gravitate towards certain white officers too. Okay,
so yeah, it would matter for practical purposes, the same way as it did for the Union officers. Yeah. Well, we're getting close to the end of our program today, and because we could either go on for another hour or just try to get people to order this book because it's such a fascinating book, but it also falls into a certain, oh gosh, how do you put this? Good ideas have their season. Good ideas have their season, and just a few months ago, we had Timothy Roberts on this show, and he had his new book, This Infernal War, The Civil War Letters of William and Jane Standard. And the thing about the Standard's letters, it was published too late to get into your book, and he was a sergeant anyway, but the thing about the Standards are they are so openly hostile to the war. And they are so openly hostile to African Americans. And they really do not fit our 21st century view of what we want these liberators to look like. And as Roberts said in his book, and we talked about it in the interview, and what you seem to say in your book, these are the stories of the people who lived then and did the liberating back then, and they had their own reasons for doing it, and none of them were as idealistic as the fictional portrayal of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain on Little Round Top at Gettysburg. People did things for their own reasons, and I think Practical Liberators is an important book for revealing the flesh and blood reasons why emancipation, why liberation took effect, and then what happened in the attitudes of the people that did it. And so congratulations on accomplishing that. But if you would, if you had a moment to answer the last question in your book, as quickly as you could, how transformative was the Civil War? We like to think of it as being revolutionary.
I think it's a complicated question, and it depends what you're talking about when you're saying transformative, and some of this has to do with definitions. I think there were issues that the Civil War settled, and there were issues that made it revolutionary. I mean, it settled this problem of slavery that had persisted since the founding of the country. I think in that way, there's a revolutionary aspect to it. It set America on a different course. It settled the question of secession. It settled that there's going to be one union, an indestructible union. I think those two issues were tremendous in many ways. I don't think it settled the issue of racial equality, and that's one thing I try to hint at the end of my book, as you're referring to, is I think the officers who came out of the Union ranks, or even stayed in, some of them, in 1865, were not ready or committed to that. Even the officers who had been most radicalized, if you even want to use that term, were not that keen on that idea. And I think in many ways that helps explain, because you're talking about a crucial group here. We're talking about men who came from key states in the Midwest and in a huge population. It's going to reveal some attitudes about that population. I think this helps explain the way Reconstruction happened, though I will be the first to admit that's a whole nother story and a whole nother process. Sure. But I think it hints at what's going to happen later with their attitudes. I mean, if I had found that all these officers were embracing voting rights and civil and political equality for African Americans, then I would probably expect things to have turned out a little bit differently. But
during Reconstruction, yeah.
Right, during Reconstruction, during Jim Crow, or the passage of the Jim Crow laws. And so I think in many ways it helps to understand the process by which slavery was eliminated. And I think it's one of the reasons I chose the Western Theater. The Western Theater is going to be where a bulk of the South slaves are, where they reside, and to understand that process and how so many people reached freedom for the first time, and the men who carried that policy out, I think helps explain a lot about that time and even beyond.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're coming to the end of our program, but again, the book featured today, Kristopher A. Teters, Practical Liberators, Union Officers in the Western Theater During the Civil War. Thank you, Chris, for coming on the show and discussing it. Thank you to the University of North Carolina Press for publishing the book and for helping Chris get here. The price is, I've thrown away the price. I think it's $32.95.
Sounds about right.
Check the webpage. You'll get the right price. Let's look at what's coming up on Author's Voice, connecting authors to the world. Tomorrow, June 8th, we will have Dr. Michael Burlingame here, and Dr. Burlingame will be discussing his new edited work, 16th President in Waiting. It's going to be a really interesting book, and so that'll be at 3:30 tomorrow afternoon. The next program on Ladybird and Friends, our program for children, author Chris Rylander will be here along with host Betsy Bird to discuss his new epic adventure series for middle grade reads The Legend of Greg, book 1 in the Failures series. Chris will join us on June 12th at 5:30. Solved. Author Victoria Thompson will join host Libby Hellman to discuss her new thriller, Murder on Union Square, and that's on Thursday, June 14th at noon. If you want to ask a question of us, you can still do it. You can do it at the Facebook page. We'll respond there, or we'll respond to you on our website. You can ask a question and order a signed copy of Practical Liberators at authorsvoice.net. If you are watching this program later on our YouTube channel, we will still have signed copies of the book left. There's a link there under your YouTube video. You can click on that. It'll take you to the order page. You can order a copy. Chris will have signed it. We'll ship it out to you. Thank you very much, Kristopher Teters, for joining us today. Thank you for the folks at home. And thank you to everyone here at Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. And thank you to everybody else. Come on back and join us again soon at Author's Voice.